Imagine a country where, the macroeconomic indicators just look like an absolute triumph of the 21st century.
Right, on paper at least.
Exactly. On paper, we are talking about an economy that over like a 20-year span sees its overarching human development score surge by an explosive 62%.
Which is a massive jump.
It's insane. And in that same window of time, the life expectancy of its citizens jumps by 2 entire decades. Plus, if you look at the political sphere, women take over nearly 40% of the seats in the national parliament.
Yeah.
So if you were just glancing at those high-level statistics, you would call it a miracle, right? You'd think you were looking at the perfect blueprint for modern national success.
You really would. It looks flawless from the outside.
But what if I told you that in that exact same country, during that exact same period of supposed miracles, over half the population remains trapped in severe multidimensional poverty, like literally struggling for basic nutrition?
Yeah, the contrast it's jarring.
And what if I told you that for the average citizen, actual wealth has effectively gone backward, just erasing almost 20 years of economic progress?
It is, it's one of the most jarring developmental paradoxes you can find in modern data today.
Right.
You have these massive, shiny billboard numbers projecting this image of rapid modernization and equilibrium sitting right alongside a daily lived reality for millions of people that, well, it tells a story of staggering systemic imbalance.
And that contradiction is our entire focus today. For you listening, we are taking a deep dive into the human development landscape of Angola.
Yeah, and we're utilizing an incredibly comprehensive set of data for this. It spans from 1990 all the way to 2023.
We are looking at everything, right? Health, wealth, gender disparity, and even their environmental footprint. And the overarching mission here for this deep dive is to understand the mechanics of what we're calling the black hole within this data.
The black hole,
Yeah.
exactly.
Because there is this hidden structural force that is actively swallowing nearly half of Angola's developmental potential. We really need to figure out how a country can look so incredibly wealthy on paper while leaving so many of its people behind.
Well, to start unpacking that, we have to establish a baseline. We need to look at the global snapshot of Angola as it stood in 2023.
Okay, let's unpack this. Lay out the numbers.
So if we look at the standard metric, the Nominal Human Development Index, or the HDI, Angola sits at 0.616.
Let me just pause and ground that number for you listening. An HDI of 0.616 places Angola at roughly 156th out of 203 countries globally.
Right.
So it is firmly in the medium development category. It pulled itself out of the absolute bottom tier.
Yeah.
But, it is certainly still in the lower half of the global spectrum.
Yeah, that is the headline number. But the moment we introduce the next metric, the facade really begins to crack.
Here's the black hole.
Exactly. When we take that 0.616 and adjust it for the actual internal inequality within the country, creating what is called the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI, the number just plummets.
It's a free fall.
It free falls all the way down to 0.360.
That is a staggering drop. We are going to dig into the exact mathematical mechanics of that plunge a little later because that drop is the literal measurement of the black hole we are talking about.
Yeah, we have to break that down. But let's round out the rest of the 2023 baseline first.
Okay, what else are we looking at?
We also have to look at the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. For Angola, that sits at 0.515, which puts them at 146 globally.
Got it.
And finally, there is the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, the PHDI. This is a relatively new way of measuring development that it penalizes a country for its environmental impact. Angola's PHDI is 0.604.
Which is fascinating, actually, because 0.604 is remarkably close to their standard HDI of 0.616.
Very close.
It suggests they are achieving their development with almost zero environmental penalty. And I know we are going to tear into the reality of that environmental score later, and I can promise you listening, it is definitely not because of a massive boom in solar panels.
Far from it, yeah.
But before we get to the environment, we have to look at the timeline. Because a 2023 snapshot only tells us where the car is parked, right? It doesn't tell us how fast it was driving to get there.
And the historical trajectory is where the narrative really takes shape.
Yeah.
If you plot Angola's HDI starting in 1999, the growth is nothing short of breathtaking.
It really is a rocket ship.
It is. In 1999, they were sitting at a different 0.379. That is the absolute trench of low development.
Barely functioning.
Right. But from that point, The trajectory arcs upward so aggressively. They hit 0.391 in 2000, 0.448 by 2004, and by 2010 they were at 0.528.
Just a relentless climb.
A relentless 15-year upward march, finally reaching 0.6003 in 2015.
So if you are a policymaker or, an international investor looking at that chart in 2015, you are seeing a rocket ship. You are seeing a nation that has completely escaped the gravity of extreme low development.
You'd be thrilled.
Yeah.
But then something violent happens to the data right at that 2015 mark.
The wall.
The momentum completely vanishes. From 2015 to 2023, the growth line just goes flat. It hits an invisible ceiling.
It's crazy.
In 2015, the HDI was 0.603. 8 years later, after nearly a decade of supposed global advancement, Angola's HDI has barely budged to 0.616.
Just a total plateau.
Yeah. There was a slight dip during the pandemic years, down to 0.609 in 2020 and 2021. But even factoring in the recovery, it is a portrait of total, prolonged stagnation.
And this is the first major question we have to answer today. You have a 15-year rocket ship ride, followed by a decade of just drifting in space. What specifically was the fuel that drove that initial burst, and why did the engine suddenly and permanently cut out?
Well, to isolate the fuel, we need to split the concept of human development into its two most fundamental lived experiences.
Okay.
The length of a person's life and the material quality of that life. Let's look at the length of life first, because this is the great, undeniable victory hidden within the data set. We're talking about life expectancy at birth.
I was looking at these numbers earlier, and they genuinely force you to pause. In 1990, a female born in Angola had a life expectancy of just 45.43 years.
Which is incredibly low.
And for males, the reality was even darker. A male born in 1990 was expected to live only 38.64 years. I mean, we are talking about a society where the average man doesn't even see his 40th birthday.
It's a devastating baseline. It really is. A look at the transformation. By 2023, female life expectancy leaped to 67.14 years. Male life expectancy rose to 62.10 years.
That is an addition of over 2 full decades to the average lifespan in a single generation. It's monumental. Let's push on the implications of that for a second.
Sure.
We tend to just read those numbers as statistical wins, but mechanically, how does adding 20 years to a population's lifespan change the actual economic and social machinery of a country?
Oh, it alters the very foundation of how a society operates. I mean, when the average lifespan is 40, you are dealing with a perpetual crisis of institutional and familial memory.
Right.
Parents die before their children are fully established.
Yeah.
You lack a robust generation of grandparents, which means child rearing falls entirely on the working age population. That severely limits their economic mobility.
Because they have zero support network.
Exactly. Furthermore, businesses and government agencies suffer from a constant turnover of experienced leadership.
Because right when someone hits their peak professional competency, they are, statistically speaking, nearing the end of their life.
Right. But when you push that horizon out to 65 or 67 years, everything stabilizes. You introduce the multi-generational household.
Which provides childcare support and frees up female labor.
Yes. You build institutional memory. And perhaps most importantly, you change the psychological time horizon of the citizen. People are willing to invest in long-term education or start a business or invest in their property because they actually expect to live long enough to reap the rewards of that labor.
It is a fundamental rewiring of national potential. That makes total sense.
It really does.
And it's worth noting the gender gap there remains remarkably consistent. Throughout this massive 30-year climb, women have consistently maintained roughly a 5-year survival advantage over men.
Yeah, that 5-year gap is a constant.
But overall, the state successfully built a basic biological barrier against early mortality. But here's the pivot, right? Surviving longer does not automatically mean those extra years are prosperous.
No, it doesn't.
And this brings us to the second half of the equation. The material quality of life. The wealth.
Right. And we measure this through the gross national income per capita, the GNI. This metric takes the total wealth claimed by the residents of the country and divides it by the population.
Okay.
And the life expectancy chart is this steady, triumphant climb up a mountain. The GNI chart is a deeply unstable roller coaster.
Let's trace the track of this roller coaster because this is where the illusion starts to really fracture for me. In 2004, The male GNI was sitting at $7,452.
Right.
Over the next 10 years, it goes on an absolute tear. By 2014, it hits a massive peak of $11,938.
Yeah, and the female GNI follows the exact same trajectory, albeit starting from a lower baseline. It rises from $5,069 in 2004 to a peak of $7,506 in 2014.
So for an entire decade, the macroeconomic indicators are just flashing bright green. Wealth is pouring into the system.
Pouring in, yes, but 2014 is the precipice.
Yeah, hold on. I'm looking at this 2014 peak of nearly $12,000 per capita for men. You're telling me a country gets that wealthy on paper and then the bottom just falls out?
Completely falls out.
Because by 2023, male GNI completely collapses back down to $7,425. That is lower than where it started in 2004. Almost 20 years of economic progress completely erased.
Vanished. And female GNI suffers the exact same fate, crashing back down to $5,853.
I mean, it is a catastrophic contraction, a lost 2 decades of wealth generation. This defies basic economic development logic for me.
How so?
Well, if a country gets to a point where it is generating nearly $12,000 per capita, shouldn't they be building infrastructure? Shouldn't they be investing in diversified industries that survive whatever caused this crash? Why didn't that wealth stick to the ribs of the nation?
Because you are identifying the textbook signature of the resource curse.
Right.
Specifically tied to a hyperdependency on a single commodity.
And in Angola's case?
In Angola's case, that commodity is oil. When a nation ties its economic destiny almost entirely to the extraction and export of a volatile global commodity, it surrenders control of its own development.
Oh, wow. So that entire 15-year rocket ship ride wasn't a result of brilliant domestic policy or a booming manufacturing sector. It was just the country surfing the wave of global oil prices.
That is the core mechanism. During the 2000s and early 2010s, global oil prices surged. This created a massive artificial influx of foreign capital. It built the illusion of a modernizing, booming economy.
But it was just a bubble.
Right, because that wealth is incredibly shallow. It doesn't require the development of a highly educated, broad-based workforce. It requires a relatively small number of highly specialized workers and massive capital infrastructure to pump the oil out of the ground.
And when the global commodity cycle inevitably turns, which it did around 2014, the illusion just shatters.
Yes. When the price of oil crashed, the national revenue stream dried up almost overnight. And because the country hadn't utilized those boom years to aggressively diversify into agriculture, manufacturing, or tech sectors that actually provide resilient, widespread employment, there was nothing to catch the economy as it fell.
Nothing at all.
The wealth simply evaporated, dragging the GNI down and completely stalling the overall HDI progress we saw earlier.
It's like building a massive, beautiful house on a foundation of sand and then acting surprised when the tide comes in and washes it away.
That's a great analogy.
But the tragedy here is actually deeper than just a macroeconomic boom and bust, because even during those boom years, even when the GNI was peaking at that $12,000 mark, there is a brutal reality about how that wealth was actually experienced on the ground.
Yeah, there is.
And this brings us to the actual black hole in the data.
To visualize this black hole, the data provides a deeply sobering calculation. The drop from the nominal HDI to the inequality-adjusted HDI, the IHDI.
We mentioned this in the intro. The nominal HDI in 2023 was 0.616. But when you factor in the internal inequality of how health, education, and wealth are actually distributed among the citizens, the score crashes to 0.360.
Right, and the magnitude of that drop is the critical takeaway here.
Mm-hmm.
It represents an overall loss of 41.56%.
It's massive.
Nearly 42% of Angola's potential human development is actively swallowed by the structural inequality within its borders.
So let me push on that mechanism a bit. When we say 42% is lost, what does that actually mean in a practical sense? Where is the leak happening? Is it a failure of the healthcare system? Are schools completely segregated by class?
Well, the data allows us to deconstruct the exact architecture of that inequality.
Yeah.
The 41.56% loss is an aggregate of 3 distinct pillars of inequality.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first pillar is health, specifically inequality in life expectancy. So while the national average lifespan went up dramatically like we talked about, the disparity in who gets access to the nutrition and health care necessary to actually reach that older age, That accounts for a 27.39% loss within the health dimension itself.
That makes total sense. I mean, the wealthy elite in Luanda can fly to Europe for medical care, while someone in a rural province might not have access to basic antibiotics.
Exactly. That's the disparity.
What is the second pillar?
Second pillar is inequality in education, which creates a 34.17% loss within the education dimension.
Wow.
Yeah, there is a massive chasm between a small segment of the population that receives comprehensive, potentially international schooling, and a vast underclass that struggles to even complete primary education.
Okay, so we have a roughly 27% loss in health equality and a 34% loss in education equality. But mathematically, to drag the entire national HDI down by 42%, the final pillar has to be absolutely catastrophic.
It is the gravitational center of the black hole. The third pillar is inequality in income.
Here we go.
The wealth gap in Angola creates a staggering 58.07% loss in the income dimension. Let that number sink in for a second. 58% of the potential value of the nation's income is negated by how unevenly it is distributed.
That fundamentally reframes everything we just talked about regarding the 2014 wealth boom.
It really does.
Because when we saw the GNI peak at nearly $12,000 per capita, the natural assumption is that the rising tide was lifting all the boats. But this 58% inequality metric proves that the average was just a complete mathematical fiction for the majority of the country.
And that is the insidious nature of macro statistics in a resource-dependent economy. The massive influx of oil wealth was captured almost entirely by a tiny, hyper-concentrated elite class.
It wasn't a rising tide at all.
No, it was a tidal wave that lifted a few luxury yachts into the stratosphere, while the vast majority of the population was left treading water. Because the billionaires got exponentially richer, the statistical average for the whole country went up. But the median reality, the daily economic life of the person in the middle of the packing, it barely changed, and in many cases, it deteriorated.
It brings to mind that old statistical joke, right? If I am sitting in a room with a billionaire, on average, we are both incredibly wealthy.
Right, exactly.
But the reality is I still have to worry about paying my mortgage next month. The average obscures the pain. So, if the macro HDI is the illusion of the billionaire in the room, we need to understand what the actual median reality looks like for the rest of the country.
We do.
If we strip away the oil wealth at the top, what is the true color of poverty on the ground in Angola?
Well, to get a clear picture of that, we have to transition away from purely financial metrics and look at the multidimensional poverty index, the MPI. The MPI is a crucial tool because it acknowledges that poverty is not just the absence of money, it is the absence of fundamental human capabilities. The data we are looking at comes from a massive demographic survey conducted around 2015 and 2016, right as the economic stagnation was taking hold.
And what I find so striking about the MPI data is the sheer scale. We aren't talking about a marginalized fringe of society here.
No, not at all.
The data shows that the multidimensional poverty headcount is 51.1%, more than half the entire population.
Right. And the deprivation intensity, which measures how deeply impoverished those individuals are, that sits at 55.3%.
So this isn't just a slight disadvantage. This is severe overlapping deprivation across multiple areas of daily life.
And this is where we have to challenge our standard assumptions about what poverty actually looks like. Because when most people hear severe poverty, they immediately picture a lack of material assets. They picture someone living without a television, without a refrigerator, perhaps living in a dwelling with a dirt floor or lacking a bicycle.
Right. That's certainly the visual that charities often use in their campaigns.
Exactly. But the data tells a profoundly different and arguably much more alarming story. When we break down the specific deprivations that make up that 51.1% poverty rate, a lack of standard assets is actually a minor factor.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It only contributes 5.8% to the total poverty burden.
Only 5.8% is driven by lack of assets. Then what are the massive anchors dragging half the country down?
The heaviest weights are structural and foundational. The single largest contributor to multidimensional poverty in Angola is years of schooling, which accounts for 18.5% of the burden.
Okay.
Close behind that is nutrition, contributing 17.3%, and the third largest is school attendance at 13.5%.
I want to pause and synthesize those numbers for you listening because the implications are just chillin'. If you combine years of schooling and school attendance, a lack of education accounts for 32% of the poverty burden. Add in the 17.3% from a lack of nutrition, and you arrive at a brutal reality. Roughly half of the entire severe poverty profile of this nation is driven by just two things: empty stomachs and empty classrooms.
And you have to view this through the lens of economic potential. Think back to our discussion about the roller coaster economy and the urgent need for Angola to diversify away from oil.
Right.
You simply cannot build a modern diversified economy when over half your population is locked in a daily struggle for basic caloric intake and foundational literacy.
No, you can't train a generation of software engineers or advanced manufacturing technicians if those individuals didn't receive enough nutrition in their formative years for proper cognitive development.
Precisely the point. These aren't just tragic social issues, they are catastrophic economic blockades. The failure to reinvest the massive oil wealth of the 2000s into basic human infrastructure, into feeding children and keeping them in classrooms, it essentially sabotaged the country's ability to pivot when the oil market crashed.
They didn't build a safety net.
No. The elite captured the financial capital, but they allowed the human capital of the nation to just atrophy.
Which makes that 58% income inequality figure from the previous segment feel even more systemic. It wasn't just a failure of wealth distribution, it was a failure of capability distribution.
Absolutely.
But as we continue our analysis, we have to navigate a profound paradox within the data, because the story of Angola's development is not uniformly a story of failure. There are specific demographics that have experienced incredible shifts.
Yeah, that's true.
And this is most apparent when we look at the data through the lens of gender.
The gender data is where the complexity of Angola's societal structure truly reveals itself. Because if we look at certain specific milestones, there are undeniable historical victories for women.
Let's start with the bright spots, specifically regarding basic survival and political representation, because the improvements in maternal health care are extraordinary.
They are. In 1990, the maternal mortality ratio, which measures maternal deaths per 100,000 live births, was a terrifying 1,101.
So giving birth was an incredibly dangerous, life-threatening endeavor.
Very dangerous. But over the next 3 decades, that number fell off a cliff. By 2023, the maternal mortality ratio had plummeted to 221.
Let's pull on that thread for a second. Going from over 1,000 maternal deaths down to the low 200s is a massive public health triumph. But how does a country manage to achieve that specific victory even while its broader economy is behaving like a volatile roller coaster and failing to provide basic nutrition?
It speaks to the mechanics of targeted, siloed public health interventions. You don't necessarily need a thriving, diversified middle-class economy to distribute basic maternal medical supplies or establish localized delivery clinics.
Oh, okay, so it's a more focused effort.
Right. Often these improvements are driven by focused state programs, heavily supported by international aid partnerships and NGOs. It demonstrates that when financial resources and political will are laser-focused on a highly specific, measurable human outcome like surviving childbirth, rapid progress is entirely possible, regardless of the macroeconomic weather.
So they can fix systemic issues when the target is clear. The second massive triumph for women is in an entirely different arena, which is national political power.
Yes.
The data here is wild. In 1990, women held just 9.5% of the seats in the national parliament. They were functionally locked out of the legislative process.
Yeah, basically no voice.
But look at the trajectory. By 2008, it jumped to 37%, and by 2023, it stands at an impressive 39.09%. Nearly 40% of the political power at the highest level of the Angolan government is held by women.
And if you presented that 39% female parliament statistic to many highly developed Western nations, it would be celebrated as a gold standard of gender parity. It projects the image of a progressive society that has successfully dismantled the patriarchal barriers to ultimate leadership.
That's the logical assumption, right? You assume that if women control 40% of the legislature, they are actively passing laws and directing resources to lift up the rest of the women in the country. But the data points to a massive structural blind spot.
This is where we uncover the mechanism of elite capture. Because while women are surviving childbirth and taking their seats in parliament, the daily reality for the average woman on the street, the woman at the absolute base of the societal pyramid, is drastically different. We have to look at the grassroots educational capital.
And this is where the narrative just breaks my brain a little bit. In 2023, the mean years of schooling for an adult male in Angola is 7.26 years.
Right.
But for adult females, the mean years of schooling is only 4.54 years.
Just let the friction of those two realities sink in.
I am genuinely struggling to square this circle. How is it sociologically or politically possible for a country to elevate female representation to 39% at the absolute peak of the political pyramid, while simultaneously maintaining a nearly 3-year gap in basic education at the bottom?
It's a staggering disconnect.
I mean, men are getting over 7 years of school. Women aren't even finishing their 5th year. How do those two extremes coexist in the same society?
They coexist because political representation at the top does not inherently rewrite the economic and cultural infrastructure at the grassroots level. What this data visualizes is a textbook case of a fractured society.
Fractured how?
The political class in Angola has successfully diversified its gender representation among the elite. The women born into the upper echelons of society, those in the urban centers with access to wealth and international education, they have shattered the political ceiling.
But the elevator they used to get to the top floor didn't go back down to the basement.
Exactly. The political empowerment at the apex has completely failed to translate into educational and economic capital for the vast majority of women. If you are a woman born into the bottom 51%, the multidimensional poverty block we discussed earlier, the fact that there are women in parliament means very little to your daily survival.
Right, because you are still likely being pulled out of school before your 5th year. Perhaps you are pulled out to help manage the household or to gather water, or because the family can only afford to send the male children to school.
Exactly. It's as if there are two entirely different sovereign nations for women within Angola. One nation where you can be a prominent national legislator, and another nation where you are denied basic literacy by age 11.
And this loops right back to the black hole of inequality. You cannot close a 58% income gap if half of your population, the female half, is systematically undereducated by a margin of nearly 3 years compared to the male workforce.
Educational capital is the absolute prerequisite for economic capital. Until that grassroots educational gap is closed, the top-down political representation remains a symbol of elite privilege rather than a catalyst for broad-based societal equality.
So we've mapped out the health, the wealth, the poverty traps, and the gender dynamics. But in the 21st century, there is one final dimension to human development that we have to evaluate.
The environment.
Yes, a dimension that increasingly dictates the future viability of any nation, the environmental impact. Which brings us to a fascinating segment of the data regarding planetary pressures.
We need to revisit that fourth card from our opening baseline, the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Right.
The philosophical concept behind this metric is vital. Historically, the standard HDI effectively rewarded countries for aggressive, dirty industrialization. It didn't care if you destroyed your forests or pumped massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, as long as your GDP and life expectancy went up.
It was growth at any cost.
Exactly. The PHDI attempts to correct that by penalizing a country's development score based on its environmental destruction.
So we compare the two lines. Angola's nominal HDI is 0.616. Their environmentally adjusted score, the PHDI, is 0.604.
Right.
The gap between those two numbers is incredibly tiny. It is only a 1.9% difference. The development line and the environmental adjustment line are practically touching.
And if a listener were just looking at that tiny 1.9% penalty without any broader context, they might jump to a wildly optimistic conclusion. They might think, wow, Angola has figured it out. They must have incredibly progressive green energy policies. They are achieving human development without taxing the planet.
You would assume they had blanketed the country in wind turbines and solar farms. But we know from the wealth and poverty data that things are rarely what they seem on the surface here. We need to dig into the actual footprint data. Let's look at the carbon emissions first.
The per capita carbon dioxide emissions, based specifically on domestic production, have actually dropped significantly over the last 2 decades. In 1999, the per capita emission was 1.088 tons. By 2023, it had fallen nearly in half, down to 0.566 tons.
I mean, on paper, slashing your per capita carbon emissions in half sounds like a massive victory for the climate. And what about the material footprint? The actual volume of raw materials like biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, non-metallic minerals that the country is extracting and consuming.
The material footprint tells the exact same story of dramatic decline. Hmm. It peaked in 2009 at 7.0, 28 tons per capita. But by 2023, it had plummeted all the way down to 2.938 tons.
That is a massive, aggressive contraction in material consumption.
It is.
Okay, so carbon emissions are down by half. The material footprint has crashed. The PHDI score is practically hugging the standard HDI score. What is the problem here? Why shouldn't we be celebrating Angola as a pioneer of sustainable development?
Because we have to ask the critical question regarding causality. Why did the footprint shrink? What is the actual mechanism driving these numbers down?
Okay, what is it?
The decline in emissions and material consumption was not driven by the installation of vast renewable energy grids or a brilliant intentional transition to a circular economy. To understand the mechanism, you just have to look at the timeline.
The timeline?
Yeah. The material footprint peaked around 2009, started falling, and then both the material and carbon footprints crashed significantly in the years following 2014.
Wait a minute, 2014. That is the exact year the wealth roller coaster went off the rails.
Precisely. The timeline of the environmental contraction perfectly mirrors the catastrophic crash in the gross national income.
Oh, wow. So the footprint is low not because they are innovating. It's low simply because they stopped producing and consuming. The entire economy contracted, and the environmental impact contracted right along with it.
It is what economists call a low-base trajectory. The environmental metrics look fantastic only because the national economic engine stalled out.
It's an illusion.
Think about it mechanically. When the GNI per capita collapses from nearly $12,000 down to $7,400, the purchasing power of the nation vanishes. People stop buying imported goods. Large-scale construction projects halt, meaning demand for concrete and steel plummets.
And industrial activity recedes.
Yes, and when economic activity recedes that violently, carbon and material footprints naturally shrink.
That is such a vital distinction to make for anyone looking at these stats. They are not accidental environmentalists. They are simply victims of an economic ebb. It is economic stagnation masquerading as environmental sustainability. A broken engine doesn't produce any exhaust, but that doesn't mean it's a green engine. It just means it's broken.
Exactly. And this brings us full circle to the overarching paradox we started with. We have forensically taken apart the machinery of Angola's human development. We have examined the fuel of the oil boom, the structural cracks of the 58% income inequality, the deep rot of the multidimensional poverty, the elite capture hiding behind the gender statistics, and the false dawn of the environmental metrics.
We've covered it all.
Now, we have to synthesize all of this into a coherent diagnosis.
Right. And to do that, I want to use the conceptual framework provided by the academic analysis in our sources. So imagine a massive 2x2 matrix, a square divided into 4 quadrants.
Okay.
The horizontal axis measures the overall level of development, running from low on the left to high on the right. The vertical axis measures equality and sustainability, running from low at the bottom to high at the top.
Based on the entirety of the data we've unpacked, where does Angola physically land on that matrix?
It lands squarely in the 3rd quadrant, the bottom right.
Yeah.
High macro development, but alarmingly low equality.
That is the perfect summary of the nation's current status. The macroeconomic momentum of the early 2000s, driven by oil, successfully pushed them to the right on the horizontal axis. They escaped the absolute low development trench of the 1990s. Elite women secured legitimate political power. The average life expectancy increased by 2 decades. These are undeniable movements to the right.
But the foundation holding up that progress is completely rotting. They are violently dragged down to the bottom of the vertical axis by that massive 58% income inequality gap, the 51% multidimensional poverty rate, and a grassroots educational deficit that leaves women 3 years behind men.
It's the statistical paradox quantified and plotted. But the purpose of this deep dive isn't just to admire the complexity of the problem. We want to look at what this specific mountain of data dictates about the path forward. How does Angola move out of that 3rd quadrant? What is the actual policy blueprint?
Well, based directly on the vulnerabilities exposed in the data, there are 3 logical structural solutions, 3 mandated steps to close the black hole. Step 1 is dealing with the elephant in the room. Confront wealth distribution.
You have to attack the 41.56% loss in the inequality-adjusted HDI. And the data shows us exactly where that leak is coming from. The extreme 58% income inequality. This extreme concentration of wealth at the very top is the systemic risk destroying the country from the inside out.
But how do you mechanically fix that? I mean, it's easy to say distribute the wealth, but in practice, what does that actually mean for a resource-cursed economy?
It requires aggressive, structural tax reforms to recapture the concentrated wealth from the elite class. But more importantly, it requires a violent pivot away from the oil economy. The state must utilize whatever capital it has left to incentivize inclusive employment sectors like agriculture, light manufacturing, and domestic services.
Real jobs.
Exactly. They need an economy that generates millions of steady jobs for the masses, rather than generating billions in concentrated revenue for a handful of elites.
Which leads directly into step 2. Rebuild foundational capacity. Because you can't build a diversified, inclusive workforce if half your population lacks basic human capabilities.
Exactly. This is the direct cure for the 51% multidimensional poverty index. State resources must be ruthlessly redirected away from vanity macroeconomic projects and focused entirely on the weakest links identified in the poverty data.
And we know definitively what those weak links are. It's not a lack of televisions, it's empty stomachs and empty classrooms.
Massive, aggressive nutrition interventions are required immediately at the grassroots level to stop the biological and cognitive stunting of the next generation. Concurrently, the state must apply laser-like focus to closing the 3-year education gap for women. You simply cannot leave the educational capital of half your population languishing at 4.5 years and expect to build a modern economy.
Confront wealth distribution, rebuild foundational capacity. What is the final step?
Step 3. Prevent the economic ebb. We saw clearly in the planetary pressure data that the material footprint and the gross national income are shrinking simultaneously. Angola cannot simply sit back, endure the current stagnation, and wait for the next global commodity boom to artificially inflate their numbers again.
Because the 2014 crash proved how utterly devastating that strategy is.
They desperately need to build new, sustainable economic engines that generate growth and consumption from within the country, rather than waiting for the price of a barrel of oil in London or New York to dictate their national destiny.
Confront the wealth concentration, rebuild the human foundation, invents a new economic engine. The data makes the necessary path forward incredibly clear, even if the political execution of that path requires dismantling decades of entrenched elite privilege.
It won't be easy.
Not at all. Let's summarize the journey we have been on today. We started by looking at a headline number that bordered on the miraculous, a 62% surge in human development. We saw a nation drag itself out of the absolute low development trench of the 1990s, adding 20 years to its citizens' life expectancy and elevating women to nearly 40% of the national parliament. The numbers bear witness to incredible, undeniable macro progress.
Yeah, they do.
But as we peeled back the layers of the data, we exposed a terrifying abyss beneath that progress. We found a black hole of inequality that is actively swallowing 42% of the country's potential. We found a roller coaster, oil-dependent economy that completely erased 20 years of wealth generation for the average citizen in a single decade.
Which is just tragic.
We found a fractured society where top-down political elite representation hides a devastating 3-year educational deficit for women on the ground. And perhaps most alarmingly, we found that 51% of the nation remains trapped in multidimensional poverty, weighed down not by a lack of modern luxury, but by the relentless daily lack of basic nutrition and foundational schooling. True human development is an illusion unless it is development that reaches the median, not just the mean.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave with the listener today. We have spent this entire deep dive forensically examining a country where an elite class has achieved remarkable political representation and captured vast amounts of macroeconomic wealth, while simultaneously the bottom 51% of their fellow citizens lack the basic caloric intake to thrive and finish less than 5 years of primary school.
It's a heavy thought.
When you look at that stark, undeniable mathematical contrast, it forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question about how we, globally, measure the concept of progress. At what point does a nation's development index stop being a measure of the country's actual lived prosperity and start being merely a measurement of the comfort and wealth of its top 1%? Next time you see a country's GDP growth celebrated in the news, or you see an HDI score climbing on a chart, look past the shiny average and ask yourself the most important question of all. Who exactly is experiencing that growth?